Hello, my name is Eric Ford. Several people have asked me, how do I go about providing feedback for case studies and other assignments that my fellow students have provided to me and would like some information on? And the purpose of this presentation is to go over some of those elements. In particular, we'd like to describe principles and strategies for providing constructive feedback, discuss common problems in giving it, and review the distinction between feedback and evaluation. And the way I've normally set up case assignments, we in fact fall somewhere in between feedback and evaluation because it is something of a continuum, and I'll show that later. So questions for discussions. What is feedback? Well, feedback is providing people with actionable information. What is the role of feedback in teaching and evaluation and management more generally? Well, feedback is what managers do more or less on a constant basis, and being very, very good at it is the difference between being a very, very good manager and a poor one. So that's why we try to train people on this competency and give them opportunities to go into it. We'll also talk about why people avoid giving feedback, what characterizes effective feedback, what problems do we commonly encounter, and how can we improve it. So what is feedback? It's communication to another person or groups of people which gives information about how he or she is perceived by others or how their work is perceived by others. And that's why in our assignment we often ask you to rank order different people's submissions to tell us which one is the best versus others that aren't as good, and why you think that that particular response was more effective in answering a particular question or solving a case dilemma, that sort of thing. It's also a way in helping our fellow students and colleagues modify their behavior, improve their skill sets, etc. Those are what we're trying to achieve here in our educational programs. Again, why provide feedback? It's a managerial performance imperative. If you need people to do things that are activated on your goals, you'll need to reinforce the positive behaviors and try to mitigate or remove undesirable behaviors. It also decreases anxiety about performance. In other words, if people are getting feedback on how they're doing, they feel much better about what's happening. You can imagine a course where all that there is a final exam that's on the last day of class, and so you spend a 15-week semester and you really don't know what's going on with your grade until the bitter end. And even then you don't know. You take the test on the last day and maybe it looked familiar, maybe it didn't. Where I went to undergrad, that was a fairly common feature, and we would often have to do it in these blue books. I see some of the blue books floating around here. And you would write out longhand at some great length what you were thinking, and it was really up to the whim of the person grading that, what you thought. And that was very anxiety driven, and as the semester built, those anxieties built. And that's not a good way to be. It's better to have some incremental feedback so people have some confidence in how they're doing. It also gives people an opportunity to be more accurate in their assessment of themselves. Feedback should be given in a way that the receiver can hear it, understand, and choose to use it or not. In other words, it needs to be offered in a constructive manner. We hear the term constructive feedback. In other words, it should be actionable. And I'll give you a few tips to check your feedback to make sure it's useful. And what is it students and your fellow students need? An understanding of what is to be learned. So in a management course, we might see that they're missing major concepts in their response that should have been applied to the question at hand. It's also a communication to the task. In other words, are you answering these in a way that are applicable in your future career? It's an opportunity to practice. We try to do these in iterations. In other words, we don't just give you one case during the semester to do. We try to undertake multiple cases so that you can get better and better as you go. And we'll talk a little bit about that more, informative versus evaluative feedback. And it's also constructive. This means it's not personalized, it's actionable, it's related to the content of the process, not the person. Essentially, constructive feedback is generally depersonalized. So a little comic strip here. Sure, that's right. Just walk out of the room. You know what your trouble is? You can't take destructive criticism, and most of us can't, in fact. Students' perceptions of feedback. Students don't like feedback. It's an irony. They're anxious when they don't get it, but they don't really want it in some respects. And moreover, they particularly don't enjoy giving it to one another. However, peer-to-peer feedback is an absolutely critical feature of the modern workplace, where we have flat organizations, where the lines of hierarchy aren't what they aren't perfectly clear. If you work in a matrixed organization where you're working with different groups that don't necessarily have the hierarchical relationship again, you need to be able to provide feedback to your peers. And where better to try it than at school, where we can do it and it doesn't cost you anything in the workplace and we can get it right. The comment, keep up the good work. In other words, don't provide superfluous feedback or just platitudes. That's not actually helping anybody. You need to have some concrete information about your mini case response was well written, well organized, addressed each question fully and completely, and helped draw more information from outside sources. I particularly liked the reference you gave to blah. You can imagine that would be a positive sort of feedback. I get more negative feedback than anything else. Yes, indeed, I would tell you that our educational system historically, and by many of the methods we're forced into with online education and stuff, we tend to largely focus on the negative, where we're trying to correct behaviors that are not value-adding, and we probably don't spend enough focusing on students' strengths and letting them know what their strengths are that they should be playing to in the future. If you catch me doing that, please let me know, and I'll try to be better myself. The feedback I receive is vague, inadequate, nonspecific. Again, one of the questions you should do is, as you read your comments before posting them to other students, is ask the question, can they act on this piece of feedback I am providing them? Is it actionable? So what is the role of feedback in evaluation? Well, we have two kinds of evaluations, formative and summative, and we'll go into these a little bit each, and they're a continuum, and in between is this mini case assignment that I like to give out to people, and you have to do some elements of both formative and summative evaluation as your feedback mechanism. A formative evaluation is done with the intent of providing ongoing information, and that's why we have multiple cases. So a student writes an answer to their first case, we then provide them with feedback, and when they go to write their second case, we hope that they integrate that feedback that they received in the first iteration into their second round. Ideally, we would have a longer time during a course, and we might get to 3 or 4 or even 5 rounds of mini cases where we can really hone our skills in answering this sort of small management problem that most people spend their professional careers dealing with. Summative evaluations are typically done at the end of a period or a program. These are your grades. This is the annual review, and I could go on at some great length about how flawed annual review processes are and why only reviewing people on an annual basis is almost counterproductive in terms of actually getting anything done in the organization other than filling out paperwork. And we can go on and on. Feedback, what does it do? It provides information. Again, I keep telling you, actionable information that students can use. I think since you have 5 or 6 cases you're generally comparing, you can reference people to other cases and say, here's an example of what I viewed as being a very strong answer to this question. Here are the elements that we're missing, and that gives you the based on observations. It's descriptive. Notice we're giving you very short time frames. It's also very immediate. This is like any behavior. The closer the feedback is to the behavior being exhibited, the more actionable it is by the consumer. Evaluation, again, this is where we're providing judgment. We use several methods. You'll notice on the feedback forms we have some scales. So we're trying to get both elements, as I mentioned, a formative and summative evaluation in place. And so you should be aware of what we're trying to do, because that's what you should be trying to do too. Why provide feedback? It's essential for learning to take place. If a faculty member gives you an assignment where it's turn in a 30-page paper on the last day of class and you don't have an opportunity to revise and resubmit based on earlier submissions or the submissions of parts, I would push back on that. I don't think without feedback being part of the system that you're really getting it. And we actually ask for an assignment in this course that is something like that, where we talk about the strategic plans and the simulation, and we'll try to provide people with some feedback, although it'll come too late for them to act on. But we do have iterations in the simulation that you should be able to see. Feedback. As I said, students are a little schizophrenic, to put it harshly, in terms of their desire for feedback. They want it, but they fear it. We need to make sure that we have a due process where people can appeal the feedback they're given, and it really shouldn't come as a surprise to people. In other words, students should be able to do some effective self-evaluation as they complete assignments. One of the things I often like to do is provide the grading rubric ahead of time for a particular assignment if I'm capable of doing that. There's been lots of research on feedback in terms of interviewing skills. Everybody's going to be interviewing for jobs. History-taking skills. This actually applies to things like medicine. We talk about clinical, but we could say managerial reasoning, etc. So I'm giving some healthcare examples that you may want to think about. Why is feedback often avoided or neglected? I would tell you in simple terms, and I didn't put in the bullets, I apologize, that feedback is hard on the person providing the feedback as it is on the person receiving it. There's a joke by Jerry Seinfeld who talks about people's greatest fear is public speaking. Their second greatest fear is death. That means when you go to a funeral, the person delivering the eulogy's got the harder of the two jobs. I think in some ways that feedback is sort of like that joke where the person giving it, even when it's negative, is often emotionally more impact than the person receiving it. Again, I've talked across this lecture about the elements of constructive feedback: timely, based on discrete observations. In other words, when you provide students with feedbacks on their case responses, you can even clip phrases out of their document and say, here, I like this. This is something I may have rewritten to look like this. Again, change on behaviors, etc. Specific, not general. Immediate, not delayed. Behavioral, not personal. Descriptive or evaluative. You know, some of that has to go back and forth. Generally, more or less. Less but more pointed feedback can be very powerful. You might strive for that. How to rate the cases. Here's how I generally do it. I read through them all once, trying to not draw any early opinions. It's impossible to do, but it'll happen. I then read through them again and start to sort them, and I might even start to note some grammatical and other types of errors that are signaling me problems. Start to note that elements that are present in the better cases but absent in others, and that'll start to help start both the positive feedback for those better cases, but some of the opportunities for improvement in the lesser cases. And lastly, you can see the notes. Think of it as an iterative process. You should really read through all of these cases 4 or 5 times collectively as you prepare the feedback. Be kind and professional. Generally start with some positive. I would wager that almost every one of our students' responses generally has something positive to think about. Then again, ask yourself the question, is the feedback on a point-by-point basis actionable? In closing, keep the personal needs and feelings out. Monitor your reactions. You should read your feedback 2 or 3 times before you post it. Time your feedback. We have a deadline here, but when you get out in the business world, it's something you'll need to manage very actively, is giving appropriate timing. And teach self-critique. You know, the better students will actually critique their own cases before they submit them and then edit. Well, thank you very much. I hope you find this helpful.